They say a widow with no husband is a ranch already sold. Nobody told the widow that. Cora Bennett stood in a house that still smelled like her dead husband's coat and did not yet know that 4 men in stiff collars were already on the road to take it from her. Grief does not knock. It walks in, sits down at the table, and waits for you to serve it dinner, and Cora had been serving it for 6 weeks straight, when the lawyers finally showed up at her door with a number scrawled on paper meant to break her. What none of them counted on, not the lawyers, not the land barons circling her fence line, not the whole county whispering that she would fold before the first snow, was the dust rising on the eastern road, 3 days out, carrying a stranger, with a promise in his coat pocket and a debt of his own to pay. By the time he reined in at her gate, the vultures had already started counting her cattle as theirs. They were about to learn how wrong they were. The house still smelled like him. Cora noticed it every morning before she remembered why it hurt. Thomas had been gone for 6 weeks. 6 weeks since the fever took him in 4 days, fast enough that the county doctor still shook his head when he spoke of it, slow enough that Cora had time to memorize the exact sound of his breathing before it stopped. She had not cried in front of anyone since the funeral. She had promised herself that much, standing at the graveside in a borrowed black dress, while half the county watched to see whether she would. Mornings were the hardest part, before the ranch demanded anything of her, before the day gave her something else to think about. She would wake in the wide bed they had shared for 3 years, reach across the cold sheets out of a habit her body had not yet unlearned, and lie there a moment with her eyes closed, letting herself pretend, for exactly as long as it took to breathe in and out twice, that he was only in the kitchen already, that she would hear his boots on the stairs any moment now. Then she would open her eyes, and the room would be empty, and the day would begin the way every day began now, with a list of things that needed doing, and no one left to help her decide which mattered most. She was standing in the front room with a basket of unopened letters when Mr. Ambrose Reed, the family lawyer, let himself in without knocking. 3 other men followed him, county men, land men, the kind who wore their hats indoors because they had already decided this house did not deserve their manners. "Mrs. Bennett," Reed did not sit. "There is a matter of the ranch's debts. I am aware of the ranch's condition, Mr. Reed." Cora set the basket down carefully, the way she set down anything she did not trust her hands with. Thomas managed the books himself. "Then you are aware they show $11,000 owed against this land, much of it to Mr. Emmett Sloan." The name landed in the room like a dropped plate. Cora had met Sloan twice, once at her wedding, where he had kissed her hand a beat too long, and once at Thomas's funeral, where he had stood at the back in a black coat that cost more than a season's cattle, and told her, with real sorrow in his voice, that he would hate to see a fine property fall into ruin. 11,000, she repeated. "That cannot be right. Thomas told me we were behind, not buried. I only report what the ledgers show." Reed did not meet her eyes when he said it, and Cora filed that away the way she filed away everything, now quietly, without letting her face show she had noticed. One of the landmen, younger and less patient than the rest, finally spoke. "Ma'am, with respect, a ranch this size needs a man who knows cattle, knows markets, knows how to fight off rustlers and bad seasons. No offense meant, but you're a widow with a garden and a house full of debt. Mr. Sloan is offering a fair price, more than fair, given the circumstances." "And what does Mr. Sloan know of my circumstances?" Cora asked quietly. "That he feels qualified to price them." The young man had the decency to flush. Reed cleared his throat and pressed a folded paper toward her, across the small table by the door. "The offer, in writing, should you wish to consider it without pressure. 90 days, Mrs. Bennett. After that, the note comes due in full, and I am obligated to tell you plainly that this house will not be able to meet it." Cora did not take the paper. She let it sit on the table between them, a small, deliberate refusal, and looked at the 4 men filling her front room with their boots and their hats and their certainty. "Gentlemen," she said, "I buried my husband 6 weeks ago. I have not yet decided what I am going to do with my grief, let alone my land. You will have my answer when I have one to give, and not 1 hour before." They left with the particular disappointment of men who had expected tears and gotten a closed door instead. Cora stood in the empty front room a long time after the sound of their wagon faded, and only then did she let herself sit down on the stairs and press both hands over her mouth, because a woman is allowed exactly 1 private minute of falling apart before she has to stand back up and be strong for a ranch that does not care how tired she is. When the minute passed, she wiped her face, straightened her spine the way her mother had taught her, and walked out to the pasture to count cattle, because it was the only task left in the day that still made sense to her. She did not know yet that she was not as alone as she believed. 3 days' ride to the east, a man named Wade Calloway was reading a letter he had carried, unopened, for nearly 2 months, because he had known that opening it meant a promise he could not take back. He read it twice, standing in the dim light of a rented room above a saddlery, and then he began packing his saddlebags without allowing himself to think too hard about why. Back at the Bennett ranch, Cora spent that same evening at the kitchen table with the household ledger open before her, teaching herself, page by careful page, the language Thomas had always handled without her feed costs, against cattle prices, the slow arithmetic of a bad season stacked on top of a worse one. She had never been foolish about money. She had simply trusted her husband with it, the way a person trusts the ground not to give way beneath them. And now the ground had given way, and she was left relearning how to walk. Near midnight, her housekeeper, Delia, found her still bent over the columns and set down a cup of chamomile tea without a word, the way she had every night since the funeral. "You don't have to figure it all out tonight, Mrs. Bennett," Delia said gently. "I don't have the luxury of not figuring it out, Delia." Cora rubbed her eyes, the numbers beginning to blur. 90 days. That's what Reed gave me. 90 days to understand $11,000 I didn't know we owed, on land my husband loved more than he loved sleeping through the night, and I intend to understand every dollar of it before I decide what to do. "Your mother would be proud of you," Delia said. "Whatever comes." Cora managed a small, tired smile at that, the first real one since the funeral, and went back to the columns until the candle burned low, because grief, she was learning, did not excuse a person from the work of surviving it. It only made the work heavier. He came at dusk, which Cora would later think was exactly like him never announcing himself with noise, only with the sudden, undeniable fact of his presence. She was at the fence line, counting the herd, a habit she had kept since childhood, because numbers, unlike people, did not lie to you. When she heard the horse, she turned, expecting Reed, or worse, Sloane himself, and instead found a stranger sitting easy in the saddle, dust on his coat, a rifle scabbard at his knee, and something careful in the way he held himself, like a man who had learned that the first 10 seconds of any meeting decided everything after. "You're on Bennett land," she said, before he could speak first. She had learned that much in 6 weeks. Speak first, or men decided the conversation for you. "I know it." He dismounted slow, hands visible. "Name's Wade Calloway. I was a friend of your husband's, ma'am. Rode with him before either of us had gray in our hair." Thomas never mentioned Calloway. "No, ma'am. I don't imagine he would have." He reached into his coat, and Cora's hand moved to the shotgun she kept leaning against the fence post before she'd decided to move it at all. Wade noticed. He did not comment on it, which she also filed away. He simply held out a folded letter, edges soft from handling. She recognized the handwriting before she recognized anything else, and her breath caught the way it still did, without warning, at small things. His handwriting on a grocery list, his boots by the door she had not been able to move yet, and now this. "Cora," it read, in Thomas's careful, slanted script. "If you are reading this, I am gone, and I am sorrier for that than I have words to say. There are things about this ranch I did not tell you, because I hoped I would have time to fix them myself. I did not. The man carrying this letter is the only person besides you that I trust with what is left. Let him stay. Let him work. He will not explain everything at once, and I am asking you to trust him anyway, because I am asking you to trust me one last time." Cora read it twice. Then she folded it along its old creases and looked up at the stranger, who was watching her with an expression she could not yet name. Not pity, which she had gotten used to and hated, but something steadier. "You'll forgive me," she said, "if a letter from a dead man isn't quite enough to hand a stranger the keys to my home." "I wouldn't ask you to." Wade's mouth moved, almost a smile, gone before it landed. "I'll sleep in the bunkhouse. I'll work for nothing but board until you trust me enough to pay me. And the day you want me gone, I'll be gone before sundown. That's the whole offer. You'll forgive me for asking outright, Mr. Calloway." "Are you dangerous?" He considered the question seriously, which she appreciated more than a quick denial would have earned him. "To some people. Never to you, or anyone under your roof. That's a promise I'm prepared to prove, not just say." "Prove it then, slowly. I don't hand out trust the way I used to." "Neither do I, ma'am," truth told. Behind them, in the long grass past the fence line, a rider Cora had not noticed sat watching from a distance one of Sloane's men, she would learn later, sent simply to see who came and went from the Bennett place, now that its owner was 6 weeks in the ground. He turned his horse and rode east without being seen, carrying news that would reach Emmett Sloane by morning. The widow was not as alone as everyone had assumed. "1 month," Cora said finally. "You work the herd, you keep your distance from the house, and you tell me the truth the moment I ask for it." "Yes, ma'am." She showed him the bunkhouse herself, rather than send a hand, walking the yard in the last of the light, and pointing out what needed doing without quite meaning to the sagging gate, the well pump that stuck, the smokehouse roof that had wanted mending since spring. Wade listened to all of it and said little, but she noticed him marking each thing in his mind, the way a man marks a map he intends to walk again. She did not offer her hand at the end of it. She was not ready for that yet. But she turned and walked back toward the house without looking behind her, and something in her chest, small, cautious, almost afraid of itself, allowed, for the first time in 6 weeks, that she might not have to carry this alone. Sloane's men came 4 days later, and they did not bother pretending to be anything other than what they were. There were 3 of them, and they rode into the yard at noon, loud enough to bring the household staff to the windows. Their leader, a broad man named Garrett, with a scar through one eyebrow, leaned down from his saddle and addressed the yard at large rather than Cora specifically, which she understood immediately as its own kind of insult. "Mr. Sloane sends his regards to the widow," Garrett said, "and his concern. Man hears a ranch this deep in debt is bringing on strange men off the road. He starts to worry about the lady's judgment. Start to think maybe it's time somebody stepped in before things get worse." "Things were considerably worse," Cora said, stepping onto the porch, "when Mr. Sloane's ledgers were the only ones anyone trusted. Tell him I said so." Garrett laughed, an ugly, practiced sound. Feisty. Thomas always did like a woman with some fire in her. He nudged his horse forward, close enough that the animal's breath stirred the hem of Cora's dress. "Of course, the fire burns out, especially out here, alone, with no husband and no—" "That's close enough." Wade had not raised his voice. That was the thing Cora would remember about it afterward. He had simply stepped from the barn doorway into the yard, unhurried, and said 4 words, and somehow the temperature of the whole afternoon changed. Garrett looked him over, the way a man looks over a dog he has not decided whether to be afraid of. "Is this the stray she's taken in?" "I work here," Wade said. "That means what happens in this yard is my business now. You've delivered your message. You can ride back and tell Sloane it was received. And if we don't feel like riding back yet—" Wade did not go for a weapon. He did not need to. He simply took one more step closer, close enough that Garrett's horse shifted uneasily beneath him, and said, in the same level voice, Then you'll be explaining to Mr. Sloan why 3 of his men got thrown off Bennett land by 1, in front of witnesses, which is a story that tends to make a man's reputation smaller every time it's told. There was a long moment where the whole yard seemed to hold its breath. One of the younger riders behind Garrett shifted his hand toward his hip, and Wade's eyes cut to him for exactly long enough to let the boy know he had been noticed, and the hand went still again. Then Garrett spat to the side, wheeled his horse, and rode out, his 2 companions following, and it was not until the dust had fully settled that Cora realized her hands were shaking. "You didn't have to do that," she said, once the yard was empty again. "I did, actually." Wade did not look at her when he said it, busying his hands with the gate latch, and Cora understood he was giving her a moment to compose herself without an audience, a small kindness, and a rare one, from a man who had just faced down 3 armed riders without raising his voice. A man like Sloan doesn't send those 3 to talk. He sends them to test the ground. If nobody pushes back, he pushes harder next time. If somebody does, he thinks twice. "You've done this before, once or twice." He finally looked up, and for a moment, something old and tired crossed his face, before he tucked it away again. "Your husband knew that about me. It's part of why he wrote that letter." Cora wanted to ask more. She could see the shape of the question in her own mind. What exactly are you, Mr. Calloway? And what exactly did my husband know that I didn't? But something told her the answer would come when it came, and pushing would only close the door she had, cautiously, left open. That evening, as she reviewed the household accounts alone at the kitchen table, she found herself listening for his boots on the porch, the way she used to listen for Thomas's, and hated herself a little for it, and then decided, after a long moment of staring at a column of unpaid figures, that she was allowed to be glad of good company in a hard season, whatever else it did or did not mean. "Supper's at 6, she said the next morning, when she found him at the corral. "You're welcome at the table tonight. Just tonight." It was the first time she had smiled since the funeral, and neither of them mentioned it, though both of them noticed. The weeks that followed had a rhythm to them that Cora had not expected to find comforting. Wade worked before dawn and after dark, mending fences Thomas had let go, moving the herd to better grass, teaching the 2 remaining hands how to read weather in the color of the western sky. He did not come to the house unless invited, and he was invited more often than either of them announced out loud, a plate left on the porch rail, a lantern lit in the kitchen window, past the hour when honest work should have ended, an unspoken agreement that grief and survival both went down easier with company. It was on a warm evening in the pasture, mending a stretch of fence that had finally given out after years of neglect, that Cora found herself working beside him without either of them having planned it. "You don't have to hold the wire," Wade said, glancing at her hands, which were already raw from the work. "I don't have to do most of what I do anymore," Cora said. "I do it because sitting in that house with nothing but my own thoughts is worse than blistered hands." She tied off the wire with more force than necessary. "Thomas used to do this stretch every spring. Said a fence was a promise you made to your land. Keep it up, and it keeps your cattle safe. Let it go, and you're inviting trouble in." Sounds like a man who thought in metaphors. He was insufferable about it. She laughed, a real laugh, surprising herself with it. He'd talk about the ranch like it had feelings, like the land could be disappointed in you. Maybe it can. Wade drove the next post with 3 clean strokes. Land remembers who took care of it. Ranchers who don't believe that usually don't last. Cora studied him while he worked the set of his shoulders, the careful economy of his movements. A man who had clearly spent years learning to do more with less. "Where did you and Thomas actually meet, Mr. Calloway? And don't tell me you rode together and leave it at that. I've had that answer for weeks." He was quiet long enough that she thought he might refuse again. Then, 4 years ago, cattle theft ring, working 3 counties, moving stolen herds through paper ranches and crooked brand inspectors. Your husband lost 80 heads that spring, and couldn't get a straight answer from anybody about where they'd gone. I was working the case from another angle. We ended up finding the same answer from opposite directions. "You're a ranger!" "Was." Something flickered across his face. "Not anymore." "Haven't been for 2 years." "Why not? That's a longer story than we've got daylight for." He met her eyes then, steady, and something passed between them that neither of them had a name for, yet not quite trust, not quite anything else, but the first stone of a bridge being laid. "I'll tell you, just not today." Cora nodded, and let it be enough. Later that week, she caught herself watching him break a young horse in the round pen, and stayed longer at the fence rail than the task required any witness at all, drawn simply to the sight of Patience meeting something wild and winning it over slowly, without force. When he noticed her there, he did not stop working, only tipped his hat slightly, and she felt her face warm in a way she had not felt in longer than she wanted to admit. "You're staring, Mrs. Bennett," he called, without turning fully. "I'm supervising," she called back, and he laughed a real laugh, low and surprised out of him, and for a moment, the whole ranch felt lighter than it had in months. That night at supper, over a simple meal of beans and cornbread, Cora found herself telling him about her childhood on a smaller spread 2 counties north, about a mother who had taught her to read a ledger before she could properly ride, about a father who had believed, unfashionably for his time, that a daughter deserved the same education in business as a son. Wade listened the way he did most things, fully, without interrupting, and when she finished, he said simply, "That's why Sloane's men underestimate you. They see the dress and the roses and miss the ledger entirely. Most people do. I don't intend to be like most people, Cora." It was the second time he had used her name without asking permission, and this time neither of them pretended not to notice. The silence that followed was not uncomfortable. It was, if anything, the opposite. A silence 2 people share when a thing has been said plainly and does not need repeating. They finished the fence line as the sun went down behind the hills, gold light pouring over land that, for the first time since the funeral, did not feel quite so much like a burden Cora was carrying alone. The following Saturday, Cora rode into town for supplies, and Wade came along without being asked, claiming the wagon axle needed a second pair of hands if it broke on the road. Neither of them mentioned that the road had never once broken an axle in Cora's memory. Town had changed toward her since the funeral, in ways both kind and unkind. The women at the mercantile still offered condolences with the particular softness reserved for a young widow, but their eyes had begun sliding, curious and a little scandalized, toward the tall stranger carrying her flour sacks to the wagon. "That's Thomas Bennett's hired man?" old Mrs. Kettering asked, not troubling to lower her voice as Cora paid at the counter. "That's Mr. Calloway," Cora said evenly. "He works the ranch." Mrs. Kettering's eyes did not leave Wade's back as he loaded the wagon. "Works it well, from the look of things. The whole town's talking about how your herd's fattened up since he came, and other things besides, I imagine." "Let them talk," Cora said, and found, to her own surprise, that she meant it. 6 weeks ago, the same gossip would have sent her home in tears. Now it barely touched her, because for the first time in months, she had something steadier than other people's opinions to hold on to the plain daily fact of a man who showed up, and kept showing up, and made no secret of why. On the ride home, wagon creaking under the weight of supplies, Wade broke a long silence with a question that had clearly been sitting in him for a while. "Does it bother you? What they say?" "It used to." Cora watched the fence posts roll past, the ones Wade had reset only days before, standing straighter than they had in years. "Thomas always said a person who lives their whole life worried about being talked about ends up living somebody else's life instead of their own. I didn't understand what he meant until he was gone, and I had to decide, every single day, whether I was going to let the county's opinion run my ranch for me. And now? Now I've decided the ranch is mine to run, gossip or none." She glanced sideways at him. "That includes deciding who I trust enough to ride into town with me, Mr. Calloway." Whatever Mrs. Kettering thinks about it. Wade said nothing to that, but the corner of his mouth moved, and he flicked the reins a little easier the rest of the way home, and Cora thought, not for the first time, that some conversations said more in what they left unspoken than in what they actually declared out loud. Willow Harper ran the only newspaper in the county, and she had a habit of finding trouble before trouble found her, which was why Cora was not entirely surprised when the younger woman appeared at the kitchen door one evening, with ink still staining her fingers and worry plain on her face. "I need to show you something," Willow said, "and I need you to promise not to tell me to burn it, because I already made 2 copies. She spread a set of papers across Cora's kitchen table records, pulled from the county clerk's office, land filings, and a string of loan documents that made Cora's stomach turn cold as she read them. "Sloan doesn't just want your ranch," Willow said. "He's been doing this for 3 years. Buys up the debt of struggling ranchers quietly, through men who aren't publicly tied to him, then waits for the owners to default, and forecloses through the courts before anyone realizes what happened. The Ashfords lost their spread that way last year. So did the Delaney's, the spring before. That's not what happened to us," Cora said, though even as she said it, doubt was creeping in at the edges. "Thomas managed our books himself. He would have told me if we were dealing with Sloan directly." "Would he have known?" Willow tapped one of the pages. "Look at the signature on this loan renewal from 18 months ago. It's not Sloan's name on it at all." Cora leaned in, and the name on the page made her sit back slowly in her chair, the color draining from her face. "Ambrose Reed. Our lawyer," she whispered. "Thomas's lawyer. My lawyer. I can't prove Reed knew whose money he was really moving," Willow said carefully, "but I can prove the money moved through him, into your husband's accounts, on terms that got worse every renewal. Somebody was making sure this ranch went further into debt every single year, Cora, and they made sure it looked like bad luck instead of a plan." "Why print any of this? Why risk your own paper on it?" Willow's mouth went tight. "Because a shopkeeper in the next county over asked the same questions I'm asking now about a different rancher, and 3 weeks later his storefront window was put in with a brick and a note telling him to mind his business. I don't scare easy, Cora, but I'm not fool enough to pretend there's no cost to this." I decided the cost of staying quiet was worse. The room seemed to tilt slightly. Cora thought of every conversation with Reed since the funeral, his refusal to meet her eyes, his insistence that he only reported what the ledgers showed, his easy comfort standing in her front room with Sloane's landmen at his back. "He's been in this house," she said quietly. "He sat across from me and told me my husband's debts, and he never once said whose money they actually were." "I'm sorry." Willow reached across the table and squeezed her hand. "I know this isn't what you wanted to hear." "No," Cora straightened, and something in her spine went hard and clear, the way it had not since before Thomas got sick. "But it's what I needed to hear. Thank you, Willow, truly. There's one more thing." Willow lowered her voice, though there was no one else in the house to hear it. "Sloan knows I've been asking questions. A man came by the print shop last week, very polite, very well dressed, and told me that a paper my size couldn't survive losing its advertisers all at once. It wasn't a request, Cora. It was a warning. 'Then we protect you too,' Cora said, surprising herself with certainty in her own voice. 'Whatever this costs, it costs all of us together, or it costs none of us at all.' That night, after Willow had gone, Cora found Wade at the corral, checking a mare's foreleg by lantern light, and told him everything. He listened without interrupting, his jaw tightening slightly at Reed's name, and when she finished, he was quiet for a long moment. 'Your husband suspected something like this,' he said finally. Not the specifics, but he knew somebody close was steering the ranch toward ruin, and he didn't trust himself to prove it before it was too late. That's the promise in that letter, Cora. He asked me to finish what he started. How long have you known Reed was involved? Suspected, not known, not until tonight. He set the mare's hoof down gently and straightened to face her fully. I needed proof, strong enough to survive a courtroom, not just strong enough to satisfy my own suspicion. Willow's records get us closer than I've managed alone in 2 months of quiet asking. It was the first time he had used her given name without hesitation, and neither of them commented on it. But something settled between them that night. Not quite a plan yet, but the beginning of one, and the quiet, dangerous knowledge that the fight ahead was going to be far bigger than either of them had first believed. The evening before the fire, Cora and Wade sat on the porch longer than either of them needed to, watching heat lightning flicker without rain along the far hills. "Something's been sitting wrong with me all week," Wade admitted, turning his hat over in his hands. "Sloane's gone quiet since Garrett got sent off. A man like that doesn't go quiet because he's given up. He goes quiet because he's changing tactics. You think he'll come at us again? I think a man who's used to winning by patience doesn't like being told no in his own front yard. He'll want it back, and he'll want it to look like misfortune rather than his own hand doing it." Wade's eyes stayed on the dark tree line at the edge of the property. "I'd sleep light tonight if I were you." Cora had laughed it off gently, told him she'd slept light every night since the funeral, and doubted she remembered how to do otherwise, and gone up to bed, not truly believing danger was close enough to touch. She would remember that laugh, later, and wish she had taken his warning more seriously than a habit of comfort. The fire started in the small hours, when the whole ranch was asleep and least prepared to fight it. Cora woke to the smell of smoke and the sound of the hands shouting, and by the time she reached the yard in her nightdress and boots pulled on without stockings, the western wall of the main barn was already a wall of orange light against the dark sky. 22 heads of prime stock were penned inside, animals Thomas had spent years breeding, animals that represented nearly everything the ranch had left to sell. "The herd!" she screamed, but Wade was already moving, a wet cloth tied over his mouth, running straight into the smoke, while 2 of the hands fought to organize a bucket line from the well. The next 4 minutes felt like an hour. Cora stood at the edge of the heat, close enough to feel it on her skin, watching the barn doors for a man who had walked into a burning building for cattle that were not even his, and she understood, with a clarity that frightened her, exactly how much she had come to depend on Wade Calloway being there in the mornings. He came out leading 4 horses and driving the cattle before him, coughing, his shirt scorched through at the shoulder, and went back in twice more before the roof beams began to groan and the hands physically hauled him back by both arms to keep him from a third trip. The barn came down in a roar of sparks a few minutes later. 18 of the 22 heads were saved. Wade's left arm was burned badly enough that the county doctor, summoned at first light, said plainly that he had come within a hair of losing the use of it. "You could have died," Cora said, sitting beside his cot in the bunkhouse as the doctor finished dressing the wound. Her voice was not steady. She did not try to make it steady. "Cattle were dying either way," Wade said. "Figured I'd rather try. That's not an answer." "No." He looked at her, pale from pain but not from anything else, and something in his gaze was very direct, very unguarded, in a way it had not been before. "I stayed because this stopped being a job to me, somewhere around the 3rd week, Cora. I'm not going to pretend otherwise, not lying here with my arm half-cooked." She did not have an answer for that, not one she trusted her voice to carry, so she simply took his good hand and held it, and they sat there in silence while the barn finished smoldering outside, and the sun came up grey with smoke over a ranch that had just survived the 2nd attack in as many months. The doctor, packing his bag to leave, paused at the bunkhouse door and looked back at them both. "For what it's worth, Mrs. Bennett, I've set a lot of burns in this county over the years, most of them from men too proud or too foolish to think before running into a fire. Your man there thought plenty. He just decided the cattle were worth the risk anyway. There's a difference, and it's not a small one. The sheriff, when he came to inspect the wreckage that afternoon, found the unmistakable marks of coal oil poured along the base of the western wall. Wasn't an accident," he told Cora grimly, crouching to look at the scorched ground. "Somebody wanted this barn gone, and wanted it gone bad enough to risk burning the whole property down around it. The question is who had the reason and the opportunity both. Cora already had a guess about the reason. What she did not yet know was that the man who had struck the match was someone she had trusted with her own front door key, and that the opportunity had been sitting at her supper table more nights than she cared to count. She found the papers by accident, 3 days later, changing the dressing on Wade's arm while he slept off the fever that had followed the burn. His coat hung over the bunkhouse chair, and when Cora reached for a clean cloth, she knocked it to the floor, and a leather folder slid out from an inner pocket she had not known was there. She should have left it. She told herself that even as her fingers were already working the ties open. Inside were letters of his own handwriting, careful and dated, reporting to someone she did not recognize by name. Surveillance notes on Emmett Sloan's land purchases going back 3 years. A list of ranch families, the Ashfords and Delaney's among them, with dates of foreclosure beside each name. And beneath all of it, a single sheet that made her hands go cold. A formal commission, signed and sealed, appointing Wade Calloway as a special investigator for the territorial court, tasked with building a criminal case against Emmett Sloan for fraud, extortion, and the wrongful seizure of ranch land across 3 counties. He was not a drifter, honoring an old friend's dying wish. He was here on official business, and the Bennett Ranch, her home, her grief, her fragile new trust, was evidence in someone else's case. "You're awake," Wade said from the cot, his voice rough with fever, and Cora looked up to find him watching her with the folder open in her lap. The exact expression of a man who has just watched something he was not ready to lose slip out of his hands. "You're an investigator." Her voice came out flatter than she intended, flat with the effort of holding something larger back. "This whole time, the ranch, the herd, sitting at my table, I was a case file to you. It started that way." He tried to sit up, winced, and stayed where he was. "Cora, it did not stay that way. And you know it didn't. You were in this bunkhouse 3 nights ago, holding my hand while my arm burned. That's not a man managing a file. I don't know what I know anymore." She closed the folder carefully, the way she closed anything she did not trust her hands with, and set it on the chair. "Thomas asked you to protect the ranch. He never once mentioned you'd be building a court case with my name and my grief as part of the evidence. Your husband knew exactly what I was, Cora. He came to me himself, 2 months before he took sick, because he suspected the debt on this ranch wasn't honest, and he didn't know who to trust to look into it quietly. That's the truth of the letter. He wasn't asking me to guard his cattle. He was asking me to find out who was robbing him, and to protect you while I did it. And you decided I didn't need to know that. I decided you'd had enough taken from you without warning already, and I wasn't going to be one more thing that got sprung on you without proof behind it." His jaw was tight, fever-bright eyes steady on hers despite the pain plainly written across his face. "I was going to tell you everything, once I had enough proof that telling you wouldn't put you in more danger than you were already in. Sloan has ruined 2 families already, Cora. Silently, legally, so cleanly that neither one could ever prove it in court. I am not going to let him make it 3. That is the whole truth, and it was true before I ever cared about anything else in this house." Cora stood at the bunkhouse door a long moment, torn between the fury of having been managed, even gently, even for good reasons, and the harder, quieter recognition that everything he had done, the fence lines, the fire, the burned arm he'd nearly lost, had been real, regardless of what paperwork sat folded in his coat. "How much of it was real?" she asked finally, quietly. "And how much of it was the job?" "All of it was real." He said it without hesitation, without softening it into something easier to hear. "The job is the reason I rode onto this land in the first place. It is not the reason I stayed past the 2nd week, and it is not the reason I ran into that barn. You can be angry at me for the first part. I'll take that, and I'll earn my way back from it if you let me. But don't stand there and tell yourself the rest of it wasn't true, because I watched your face when you said it, and you don't believe that any more than I do. You should have told me," she said finally, "the day you arrived. You're right." He did not defend himself further. which, more than anything else he could have said, was what finally let her breathe again. "I'm telling you now. Everything. Ask me anything you want." She asked him, over the following hour, more questions than she had asked anyone in 6 weeks about the Rangers, about why he had left, about the 2 families he had failed to save in time, and the weight he still carried for it, about what exactly the commission in his coat obligated him to do next. He answered every one of them plainly, without flinching from the parts that made him look worse rather than better, and by the time the lantern burned low, something between them had not been repaired exactly, but rebuilt on steadier ground than before. She did not answer the marriage question neither of them had asked yet, not that night. But she left the lantern burning in the bunkhouse window until dawn, which they both understood, without either of them saying so, was its own kind of answer. The sheriff came back 4 days later, with news that turned Cora's stomach cold all over again. The coal oil used to set the barn fire had been purchased from the county store by Tucker Hale, the ranch's longest-serving hand, a man who had worked Bennett land since before Cora had married into it. "There has to be a mistake," Cora said, though even as the words left her mouth, she was remembering small things: Tucker's absence the night of the fire, his sudden new boots the week after, the way he had always seemed to know exactly when Reed's men were coming before they arrived. They confronted him in the tack room, and Tucker did not even try to lie once Wade laid the purchase record on the workbench between them. "You don't understand what Sloan does to men who cross him," Tucker said, his hands shaking. "My brother owes him money. Owed him money. Sloan said the debt disappears if I make sure the widow gets desperate enough to sell quietly, without a fight. I never meant for anybody to get hurt in that fire. I swear it on my mother's grave. I thought the stock would be moved out before." "You tried to burn a herd alive to save yourself a debt," Wade said, low and hard. "And you nearly cost me my arm doing it." "I know." Tucker would not look at either of them. "I know what I did." Cora felt something twist in her chest that was not quite anger and not quite grief, but some tired cousin of both. "You could have come to me, Tucker. You could have told me what Sloan was holding over you, and we would have found another way. Widows don't fix men's debts, Mrs. Bennett. Not out here. I didn't think you had it in you to fight him, and I didn't think I had a choice." It was, in its own bitter way, the same mistake the whole county had made about her since the funeral. The assumption that grief made a woman weak instead of simply making her tired, and that tired was the same thing as being beaten. Cora looked at Tucker for a long moment, weighing fury against pity, and finding, in the end, that she had room for a hard kind of both. "How long has Sloan had his hand around your brother's debt?" she asked. 2 years. Started small. A loan for seed money after a bad season. Grew every time my brother fell short on a payment, the way Sloan's loans always do, until it wasn't a debt anymore. It was a leash. Tucker's voice broke on the last word. "I hated myself the whole time I was doing it, Mrs. Bennett. I want you to know that, even if it doesn't buy me anything. You'll give a full statement to the sheriff," Cora said. "Everything, Sloan, Reed, the fire, all of it. Do that, and I will ask the court for mercy on your sentence, because I believe you when you say you didn't want anyone hurt. Refuse, and I will make certain the court hears only that you tried to burn my home to the ground." Tucker gave his statement within the hour. It named Reed as the man who had falsified the loan renewals, and Sloan as the man who had ordered both the debt manipulation and the fire. And it was, Wade told her quietly afterward, exactly the missing piece his case against Sloan had needed a witness willing to speak, on the record, about how the whole scheme actually worked. "We have him now," Wade said. "Sloan doesn't know it yet, but we have him. What happened to Tucker's brother? If the debt was extracted through threat and fraud, the way Tucker describes, a judge can void it entirely. It won't undo what Tucker did. But it might be enough to keep one more family from losing everything, the way the Ashfords and Delaney's did." Wade folded the statement carefully into the growing case file. "Mercy and justice aren't always the same animal, Cora. Sometimes the kindest thing a person can do is make sure both get a fair hearing, instead of picking only one. Cora looked out at the scorched, empty patch of ground where the barn had stood and thought of Thomas's letter and of every ranch family who had lost everything to a man too careful to ever be caught. Then let's make sure the whole county knows it too, in public, where he can't quietly make it disappear. The County Harvest Gala had been Emmett Sloan's favorite stage for years, a night when every rancher, banker, and judge in 3 counties gathered under one roof, and Sloan liked nothing better than to remind them all, gently and expensively, exactly who held the most paper in the room. Cora arrived on Wade's arm in a dress the color of the pale roses she had spent 6 weeks arranging on her dead husband's mantle, and if her hands trembled slightly as they climbed the ballroom steps, she kept her chin level enough that no one watching would have known it. "You don't have to do this tonight," Wade murmured as they crossed the threshold, the orchestra tuning somewhere beyond the crowd. "We could wait for the formal hearing. Let the court do this quietly." Sloan built his whole life on doing things to people quietly, Cora said. "I want him to lose it in front of everyone who ever watched him do it, and said nothing." Sloan found them within the hour, smiling with the easy warmth of a man who has never once had to answer for anything in his life. "Mrs. Bennett, I confess I'd expected to see you at this gala with a signed deed in hand, not a hired man on your arm." "He's not hired," Cora said. "Not anymore." "No?" Sloan's eyes flicked to Wade with the first flicker of real unease Cora had ever seen cross his face. "And what is he then?" "A special investigator for the territorial court," Wade said, stepping forward. "Currently building a case against you for fraud, extortion, and the wrongful foreclosure of at least 3 ranch properties in this county alone, including this one." The room did not go silent all at once. It went silent in a spreading ring, conversation dying outward from their small group until the entire ballroom had turned to watch. Sloan's smile held a beat too long, the way a man's smile holds when he is deciding, in real time, how much danger he is actually in. "That's a serious accusation to make in a public room, Mr. Calloway. It's a proven one." Wade produced the folder from inside his coat, the same folder Cora had found weeks earlier, thicker now, with Tucker's signed statement and Willow's records. "Ambrose Reed falsified loan renewals on your instruction, funneling your money through Thomas Bennett's accounts under terms designed to guarantee default. Tucker Hale has confessed, on record, to setting fire to this rancher's barn on your orders, after you used his brother's debt to force his cooperation. And the Ashford and Delaney properties show the identical pattern, going back 3 years. Reed, standing near the punch table with the particular stillness of a man who has just realized every exit in a room is being watched, made the mistake of trying to leave. The sheriff, who had been waiting at the ballroom doors precisely for that reaction, stepped into his path. "Cora," Sloan's voice dropped, low enough that it was meant only for her, an old habit of charm, reaching for one last use. "You don't want this fight. Think of what it costs a woman alone to take on a man like me in open court. I buried my husband 6 weeks before you started circling my ranch, Mr. Sloan." Cora did not raise her voice either, but every word landed clean across the space between them. "I have already survived the worst thing this year could do to me. You are not it." From the edges of the crowd, a voice Cora recognized called out, "Willow Harper," notebook already in hand, ink-stained fingers steady, despite the room full of the county's wealthiest men watching her write. "Mr. Sloan, would you care to comment for tomorrow's paper on the Ashford and Delaney foreclosures before the sheriff escorts you out? Or shall I simply print what's already been sworn to a judge?" A ripple of murmurs moved through the crowd of men who had done business with Sloan for years, exchanging glances. A banker near the punch table, quietly stepping back, as though putting distance between himself and a debt he did not want examined too closely. The mask Sloan had worn so easily for so long was slipping in real time, in front of the only audience that had ever mattered to him. The silence that followed Cora's answer was, she would think later, the loudest sound she had ever stood inside. Sloan was arrested within the week, the case against him building quickly once Reed, facing his own charges, agreed to testify against his former employer rather than face them alone. The Ashford and Delaney families, hearing the news, came forward with their own long-buried grievances, and what had once looked like a string of unfortunate ranch failures was revealed, in the cold light of a county courtroom, to be exactly what it was: a careful, patient theft dressed up as bad luck. The trial itself took the better part of a season. Cora testified twice, plainly and without theatrics, and found, to her own quiet surprise, that the courtroom held far less power over her than the empty front room had on the day the lawyers first came for her home. Wade testified as well, his commission and his case file laid out for a jury that took less than a day to return a verdict neither of them had ever seriously doubted. The Bennett Ranch survived. More than survived, with the debt exposed as fraudulent and partially forgiven by court order, and with a herd rebuilt slowly through the following spring. The land began to look, for the first time since the funeral, like a place with a future in it, rather than only a past. Cora rebuilt the barn on the same footprint as the old one, because some promises, she had decided, were worth keeping exactly where they started. Wade stayed on past the trial, past the season, past the point where either of them could reasonably call it business anymore, and one evening the following spring, mending the same stretch of fence where they had first talked honestly about grief and land and the promises the dead leave behind, he asked her to marry him with as little ceremony as he had first arrived, plainly, directly, and entirely certain of the answer before she gave it. "I never planned on staying anywhere long," he told her, turning the wire spool over once in his hands, buying himself half a second more courage. "Then I watched you stand in a burning yard and testify in a courtroom full of men who underestimated you twice and were wrong both times, and I stopped wanting to be anywhere else." She said yes, standing in the pasture, still holding a spool of fencing wire, because that, she told him, was exactly the kind of proposal Thomas would have approved of: practical, honest, and rooted in the land they both intended to keep. They married in the fall, a small ceremony on the porch overlooking the pasture, with Willow standing as witness, and half the ranch hands crowded at the fence line to see it done. Tucker Hale, released early for his testimony and his brother's freed debt, sent a wedding gift of his own, making a hand-carved fence post, the first one he had cut clean since the fire, with a note that said only, "For a fence line that held, even when I didn't." The vultures who had once circled Bennett land found other ranches to watch after that. They had learned, the hard way, that some widows do not fold. Some of them simply wait for the right storm to prove exactly how strong they always were. Willow's paper ran a final piece on the whole affair the week after the wedding, not about Sloane's downfall this time, but about the ranch itself, the rebuilt barn, the growing herd, the widow who had refused to sell. She ended the article with a line Cora kept clipped inside Thomas's old ledger for the rest of her life. "Some storms arrive to destroy a house. Others arrive only to prove how well it was built." Cora often thought, in the years that followed, of the lesson the whole ordeal had carved into her, that grief and weakness are not the same thing, that the people who count you out are usually the ones who never truly looked, and that the debts worth fighting were rarely the ones written on paper at all. She raised her children, in time, to read a ledger the way her own father had taught her, and to never mistake a person's quiet for their absence of strength. And on quiet evenings, mending the same fence line that never seemed to stay finished for long, she would sometimes catch Wade watching her the way he had, that very first evening, careful and certain all at once, and think that some promises, made by a dying man to a friend he trusted, turn out to be the truest gift a person can leave behind. If this story moved you, stay close, there is more to come, and I would love nothing more than to hear from you directly. Subscribe to see how this unfolds, and comment below where you're watching from. I will love to say hello to you, just to know how far our story has traveled to reach you.